Hi everyone, welcome to lecture 3.2. Here we're looking at the sources and dimensions of competitive advantage, and I apologize, I'm on my work computer at the office, and unlike the Mac version of PowerPoint, this one doesn't let me move my face around the screen, so my face may at points obscure the text, but I'll try to explain anything that's behind my head that you can't see on these slides, and I'll also post the slides for you guys. So a lot of what we've been talking about until now in past lectures has been leading up to this idea that our strategy seeks to mobilize resources and capabilities in ways that meet opportunities and threats in the external environment. Our resources and capabilities are inside the firm, opportunities and threats are in the external environment outside the firm, and we try and match our strategy or formulate a strategy that will match resources and capabilities to opportunities and threats in ways that give us a competitive advantage. How do we know when we have a competitive advantage? Well, a competitive advantage is something that allows us to get those above average profits, or in other words, oops, I'm trying to write on the screen here, but it's not liking it. Yeah, it just won't let me mark it up for some reason. Never mind. Profits that exceed our cost of capital. So we have a competitive advantage, or rather a competitive advantage, and particularly a sustained competitive advantage, allows us to repeatedly and over the medium to long term capture profits in excess of our cost of capital. If we're profitable but we're not meeting our cost of capital, we're still going to be in trouble. We won't be able to pay our lenders, we won't be able to pay our investors the returns that they demand for the level of risk and their expectations for our firm. Good. So what we're going to look at today is how do competitive advantages emerge? Let's get into the nitty-gritty of this. And to step back a second and ask, well, what does this question even mean, and why are we asking it? Well, this goes back to classical economics. In economic theory, or especially classical economic theory, if you assume efficient markets, nobody should have profits above their cost of capital. The competition drives all profit down to what's called the equilibrium weight, where profits just meet the cost of capital, and essentially nobody earns what's called rents. Rents are an economics term for what we call above average profit. So we have to ask then, well, if we agree with them that and we do, that efficient markets, in an efficient market, which is often hypothetical, right? There are very rarely perfectly efficient markets, but how do competitive advantages emerge? An economist would say this is always the result of some kind of monopoly. And for our purposes, though, and one of the reasons we ask this question is, well, we're not interested in making the industry average profit. We're not interested in breaking even, although that's certainly better than not breaking even and not covering our cost of capital. But what causes these market imperfections that allows us to find a place or a strategy or a position where we can actually make above our cost of capital? And there's two ways this happens. One of them is through external sources of change, and one of them is through internal sources of change. It's the changes in the long run. All industries and all markets will over time converge to that competitive state of equilibrium where prices and profits rather just cover the cost of capital. So the way we get these market imperfections is when something changes to disrupt that equilibrium. And the way this can happen is either through external sources of change or internal sources of change. External sources of change Sometimes that just includes what they call here resource heterogeneity. This used to come up, the classical economists would give it the example of land. If you're talking about, and they even use the term rents to initially to talk about the differential productivity of land. Some countries have land that produces more abundant crops than others. And so if you're in one of the countries that produces more crops, your costs will be lower, you'll produce more, and you'll achieve, that land will be worth more. You have different resources. If you think about oil and gas, certain countries have very pure deposits of oil in a large amount, like Saudi Arabia, and to some extent Louisiana. Louisiana has a type of oil called Louisiana Sweet. Where I'm from in Alberta, we have a very heavy type of oil that costs a lot to extract, then costs a lot to refine. So we have a disadvantage in Alberta just because of resource heterogeneity. That heterogeneity just means differences. And sorry, I guess I should clarify. So these at the bottom here, and I can't highlight it unfortunately because PowerPoint's being annoying. The bottom here, these are the ways that external sources of change can confer a competitive advantage or create imperfections. So sometimes I like to say this first one here, resource heterogeneity, you're kind of just in the right place at the right time. You haven't done anything particularly innovative, you just happen to have a resource that is valuable and more valuable perhaps than other resources held by others. So the next one here, superior anticipation of change. Now something is happening inside the firm. There's some proactivity. A firm and its managers see something coming down, an external change that's happening, sort of like we talked about in our Scanning the Periphery article, and they were able to position themselves in a way that allowed them to profit from the change that they foresaw. Maybe think about firms that foresaw the importance of rare earth minerals, and as electronic vehicles and battery technology became better, they might have foreseen that these rare earth minerals would become more valuable, so they positioned themselves to get into that industry early and get a large share of that business. Trying to think of other examples here. Netflix saw the move to streaming and positioned themselves early on to be a streaming video service before companies like Blockbuster and others saw and responded to that and anticipated that change. The third one here is superior agility in responding to change. In some ways this is less a lower level capability than the anticipation, right? With anticipation, you see it coming and you get there quickly. With agility in responding, the change has happened, but you're able to shift quickly. Microsoft is a company that seems to be doing this in their gaming sector. Microsoft has seen, and there's elements of anticipation as well. They see the change in the video game industry where it's moving now from a console-based business model where you just have to sell the console, sell the most consoles so you can get as many users as possible, and then and hopefully then video game studios will produce games for you. Microsoft, and now with the streaming business model, which it's moving to, it's not there yet, it is actually the creation and the ownership of the content that gives the most value. So that example is maybe a bit of both. Streaming video games and video game subscription models have been in the works for a while now, and Microsoft is really moving quickly and buying a lot of video game studios in response to that change, but also partly in anticipation. So there's a bit of both. A company, maybe a distillery, a company that made hard liquor. A lot of those companies pivoted after the COVID pandemic to making hand sanitizer. That would be more of a response. They didn't see COVID coming. If they did, that, leaving conspiracy theories or whatever might have happened aside, a lot of firms had to adapt to COVID. So, for example, maybe a good example of response here would be companies like Best Buy moving very quickly to provide curbside shopping, and doing that faster than a lot of the competition. So those are external sources of change, but there are still firm level strategies that can better or not, or do better or not, at capitalizing on those external changes, with the least reliable strategy just being we happen to be at the right place and have the right resources when the change happened. Saudi Arabia wasn't a particularly wealthy country until the invention of the internal combustion engine and the ensuing demand for oil and gas really took off, and they just happened to have a lot of good oil reserves. Now we move to internal sources of change, and here we're getting into very valuable capabilities. The ability to create the change strategically really gives your company an advantage over other firms if you can do that and do it repeatedly. So what does that look like? Well, some firms just deploy superior resources and capabilities, and that can change an industry. A good example here might be Japanese car manufacturers in the 70s. They innovated their production techniques and their manufacturing so that they were able to achieve both higher quality and lower cost at the same time, and that really transformed the automobile industry, as you guys read about in Michael Porter's article on strategy versus operational efficiency. Toyota pushed that frontier forward so far that it created a change in the industry from which they were able to profit for a couple decades. But as Porter would point out, more valuable than that is the ability to innovate strategically, not just excellence in certain resources and capabilities, but real innovation that finds better positions and changes industries, not just on the basis of, say, a technology or a discovery, but entrepreneurial activity. And you can't see the two examples listed there. One of them is new business models, a new way of delivering the industry's product. Here, a great example would be Uber or Netflix. Both those companies provide, especially Uber, provides a service. There's a business model innovation there. Rather than a taxi company that owns a fleet and has a bunch of salaried drivers, the Uber model is a platform business model. All it does is it connects people who want to ride to people who have a car and are drivers. And it changed, and same thing with Airbnb. Airbnb doesn't own any hotels, or they might, but it's a small part of their business model. They changed the business model by simply connecting people who want a place to stay with people who own a property. The one that's kind of covered up here is new market spaces, or blue oceans. The classic example of a blue ocean strategy, well, I'll describe what it means first. The idea here is that a red ocean is red with the blood of competition. Think sharks fighting it out over the fish in those waters, and it gets very bloody. A blue ocean is a new market that hasn't been exploited. And the classic example is the Nintendo Wii. The console industry was a red ocean, even though there was only two main players, Xbox and PlayStation. Because of the network effects, they were very much fighting over the same type of gamers. Gamers who wanted higher frame rates, better graphics, and high intensity, what's been called the hardcore gamer. We found a whole new market of underserved gamers who actually weren't even gamers yet, what's called the casual gaming market, and was very successful at that. And if you're old enough to remember it, to have owned a Wii, one of the amazing things about the Wii was that people often owned either an Xbox or a PlayStation as well as a Wii, because the offering was so different and you used it in a different way. It was very technologically unsophisticated. It was old tech. The graphics weren't competitive. The technology wasn't competitive with PlayStation or Xbox, but the type of gaming that you did on it, and even the way that you interacted with the console through the nunchucks, was completely different and brought online demand that wasn't exploited. It was one of the most successful console launches of all time, and I believe they actually made profit on their consoles from the start, which most console companies don't. Most console companies make a loss and then try to recoup it on licensing fees for the games. So how can we use this knowledge to create, and what are some of the strategies, digging in a little deeper here, for creating internally generated change? And the key word here is innovation. Now, innovation is different from an invention or a discovery, and the difference is the creation of customer value. It's not enough just to come up with a new technology or a new product or a new scientific discovery if nobody wants to pay for that. So the key here is the creation of customer value from new products, experiences, or modes of delivery. New products would include things like the Wii. Experiences, maybe think of things like, and some of these are fads, but axe throwing. That was a new experience and social activity that became really popular, say 6-7 years ago. I remember we started doing our work socials at axe throwing places. Same thing with lock rooms. That's just one example. Different holiday experiences, or modes of product delivery. Well, Netflix would be a great example there. It wasn't a new product, it was still films and video and shows, but people accessed it in a different way. Same thing here with Uber. Same product, same service, right? Getting a ride somewhere, but it's a new way of accessing the product. There's some examples here. You maybe create a whole new market or industry, like that blue ocean idea. You create a new segment, or I guess they've listed Nintendo Wii here. So that's a segment of the gaming industry, I suppose you could say. So I guess with a whole new market, you're creating, not just taking a segment of an industry, but you are creating a new industry altogether. Facebook and social networking. The iPad really did this for tablet computing. They're really tablet computing really wasn't an industry, very, very small, unsuccessful one until the launch of the iPad. Other ways that competitive advantages can be obtained, reconfiguring the value chain. Zara is mentioned here. They're a company that created a very tight link between their retail stores and their design and production that allowed them to get new lines to their stores faster than any other company by I think it was 3 weeks from order to production to being on the shop floor, versus more traditional clothing retailers where maybe it might take up to 6 months to get a new line on the floor, long lead times. IKEA in furniture, they really changed the value chain in that it wasn't furniture that was made to order, like maybe you get at a place like Ashley. The furniture, you went and viewed the showroom, you saw the furniture in a context, you wrote down the number, and then you actually had to go and get the furniture yourself and put it together yourself. They outsourced the assembly of the furniture to the buyer. You can reconceptualize the product. Cirque du Soleil took the traditional circus, which was sort of a I don't know how to describe it, a rough and rowdy, cheap financially experience. It was heavily based on animals. I'm old enough to have been to a circus, a traditional circus where there were bears riding bicycles. As the treatment of animals became a wider social concern. It sort of put that model out of business, but Cirque du Soleil came with a version of the circus that was very much focused on human performers and had elements of choreography and athletics, and they were able to charge a very high price, and there was music included. It was more like a Broadway play almost. They reconceptualized what the circus could be. Starbucks did that with coffee shops. It's almost hard to think back to a time before Starbucks, and some of you guys might be too young to really remember, but a coffee shop was in North America, it was sort of like a truck stop experience, or maybe McDonald's. You paid, you wouldn't pay more than $1 for your coffee. It would have free refills. It was usually just a very plain offering and very cheap, with pretty much every coffee shop competing on price. And Starbucks basically turned it into a place where you spent $5 on a coffee with a very customized drink and a differentiated experience. They had comfy sofas. Essentially, you got to pretend like you were on the set of Friends in a New York coffee shop, and through that they were able to find a differentiated position by reconceptualizing the whole coffee experience. You'd go for a coffee instead of to the bar to get a drink with your friends. Apple did this with computers, and especially the iPad. New performance, and you might call this new price performance combinations. Low prices with quality with Virgin. Low prices with style, if you think of the fast fashion market, H&M being an example that we have here in the USA. So that's a different price performance ratio or combination. Before, you either chose something that was fashionable or something that was cheap. The fast fashion, these early pioneers created this fast fashion industry. Here's some examples of business model innovations. The free content supported by advertising model, which is everywhere now. It's what pays the bills at Facebook and Google. You use Google for free, and they make their revenues by advertising. Same thing with a lot of news sites. Platform business models. This is actually a relatively old model where you're just connecting buyers and sellers and taking a cut of the sale. The internet has greatly enhanced the amount of platform business models and the potential for platform business models. Uber's a platform, Airbnb's a platform, eBay's a platform. Shared ownership models. Zipcar, NetJet. Think about maybe a timeshare where you own a portion of a condominium in Mexico that you can use for a certain part of the year. Franchising, that was an innovation that we're all used to now, but Singer Sewing Machine operated a franchise dealership network. Now we have many firms, especially food firms, operate via franchises, right? McDonald's, Subway. There's more examples here. What's the famous razor and blades model? In razors, mail order, which has developed into sort of what we now have as Amazon. When I was in high school, if I wanted a new skateboard, I had to get the CCS catalog from California and send them my money by a check, and then I'd get my skateboard in the mail 6 to 8 weeks later. Obviously, that's been enhanced greatly by the internet and the speed of communication and delivery. But these are all not new products, but new ways of delivering the products and new ways of capturing value, creating value, and then capturing value from the customers. Blue ocean strategy, and I would say that those categories aren't exclusive. You can reconceptualize a business model in a way that creates or finds a new segment of a market. Cirque du Soleil is considered another example of a blue ocean strategy. And it shows here essentially what this graph is getting at is that it offers something precisely different from the traditional circus. Whereas the traditional circus is high in humor and thrills and danger, Cirque du Soleil is low. It doesn't have any performing animals either. But then when you get to the things that are low for the traditional circus, It's higher for Cirque du Soleil. Costumes and dancing and music, not a big deal at a circus. Nobody goes to the circus to hear the music. At Cirque du Soleil, that's part of the experience. They made it more comfortable. You're not sitting on the bleachers at a convention center. They'll set up big tents in very elaborate locations. So they basically just sought to do things completely different. And there's an interesting avoidance of direct competition here. That's highlighted somewhat in Porter's article on what is strategy. Find a place where other people aren't competing, and ideally a position that's defensible, where it can't be easily imitated for reasons we've examined. And we'll talk about more right now. So we've talked a little bit about for a resource or capability to confer a competitive advantage, it has to be valuable, rare, not imitatable, and organized so that you can appropriate the value. That imitation one is probably in some ways the hardest. Some of the others can be easy, but not in the long term. So if we want a sustainable competitive advantage, we want to dive a little deeper into what we can do to protect ourselves from imitation. And so we call these, here we have, well, what would a company need to do to imitate our competitive advantage? And then on the right, what isolating mechanisms do we have at our disposal, or what methods do we have of preventing that imitation? The first thing is that a competitor needs to be able to actually identify the source of our competitive advantage, or the fact, not even the source of the competitive advantage, the fact that we have a competitive advantage. And so here they say, well, if you can actually keep your competitors even from knowing how well you're doing, they won't even know that they should be imitating you. One of the best ways to do this, well, if you think about it, how do firms know how well we're doing? Well, if we're a publicly traded company, they can see our profits. So how can we keep other firms and other individuals from seeing how profitable we are? Well, we can go private or stay private. A lot of family firms are privately held, and they don't have to publish their financial results. Nobody knows how they're doing. You might have an idea, you might estimate based on other similar companies in the market, but if you can fly under the radar, you can stay in a great position for a long time without anyone realizing it. I've had clients in banking, privately held companies that were just making incredible returns, and they were privately held, so nobody knew how profitable what they were doing was. One firm was a company that had contracts for the shopping malls to do to clean their drains. Incredibly profitable company, and just one of those things that they were small enough, and they were privately held, and so nobody really knew there was that much money to be made. Incentives for imitation. Well, maybe people can see that we're doing well and we're in an attractive position. Is there anything we can do to prevent them or deter them? One of them would be signaling aggressive intentions to imitators. We've looked at some of these. If we can, perhaps if somebody tries to enter and we show that we're going to really respond with aggressive pricing, we're going to lower our prices to scare them away. If we're already established, we probably have a better cost structure. If we have some economies of scale, we can probably, and combined with maybe some cash reserves or some decent cash flow, we can lower our prices and fight out a price war that we can last longer than them in, and they'll leave, and everyone else who saw that will be scared from trying to come in and compete. It's kind of like a display of force that makes an example, and people see that example and don't want to, they know that you'll respond aggressively. Preemption is another way to deter competition. If you just go out and invest a ton, you can make it or show that it won't be profitable for other firms to enter. A great way to do this is by making huge fixed capital investments or investing in capacity if you're a manufacturer. If you go ahead and put, let's say that you're TSMC, the semiconductor company, and you decide, okay, we want to capture America. You go and invest in a plant that can produce 1 million chips a year. And if everybody else knows, well, the whole market for chips, the demand is only 1 million chips a year, they're not going to bother investing. You've already made that investment. And basically people know that you're going to produce 1 million chips a year no matter what they do. They do the calculation and say, well, there's this much capacity online. Unless we can do something better than them, anything we do is just going to be competing the profits down to equilibrium, and it's not attractive anymore. So that's active signaling, or even actions you can take to reduce the incentives of competitors to try and enter your industry, or potential competitors. If we can prevent other firms from diagnosing the source of our competitive advantage, that can also help us. Porter gets at this when he talks about the fact that a good strategy is based on a unique combination of activities that are so hard to disentangle that competitors can't figure out what the special. There is no special sauce in a sense. It's the combination. It's not any one thing you're doing. It's the way all your activities fit together that gives you a competitive advantage, and competitors or potential competitors just will be hesitant to try because they just can't figure out how you're doing it. An example I love for this idea is Buc-ee's. I think I've mentioned Buc-ee's in another lecture, but if you were to try and figure out what is it that makes Buc-ee's so financially successful, I don't know. Is it that they have 50 gas pumps? Is it that they have large locations? Is it where they put their locations? Is it the fact that they serve food? Is it the fact that they sell merchandise? Is it the branding with the beaver? Is it the people? Is it the culture? And the fact of the matter is, it's probably all of the activities working together for a extremely good strategic fit. And you can't just pick apart any one of those items or even a combination. And even if you could get your hand on all those resources, you wouldn't be able to fit them together in the same way. If I was to ask you guys, if I was to give anyone here $10 million, could you go and start a company like Buc-ee's that competes in the same space? That's not where I would invest my $10 million. I'd buy pizza shops. More on that later. And finally, at a most basic level, if we can prevent, or if we have resources and capabilities that aren't mobile, here we're looking again kind of more specifically at those VRIO factors. If they're difficult to replicate, if they're immobile, if it's based on some proprietary technology perhaps for which we have a secure patent, not always, but in some cases that can be enough to prevent others from acquiring those resources and copying us. Coca-Cola's branding, for example. Coca-Cola is difficult to imitate, not because, I don't think I've said before, not necessarily because of the secret Coca-Cola recipe. In fact, in taste tests, when Pepsi ran the taste test challenge, where they did a blind, try both of these and say which one you like better, most people preferred Pepsi. So that's clearly not where the advantage is. It's in the durability of their brand. And Coca-Cola has spent a ton in advertising and marketing, and that's quite difficult to replicate. It's also difficult to replicate sort of the historic image that they have, the association with Santa Claus and the Christmas commercials, and even their distribution network. Coca-Cola, despite what you might think, has this really durable advantage based on millions and billions spent over the years on branding, for which they now have economies of scale. I'm actually just not going to get into this slide very much because I can't figure out what they're getting at, and it's not in the textbook that I could find. So I tried to figure out especially what they're getting at here with things like contrarianism and overshooting, and I have to confess I couldn't find it in the textbook. If you find it, let me know. Textbook's optional for this course, so no pressure. But another consideration here is the fact that our choice and the way we achieve a competitive advantage, or our choices, will largely be determined by our chosen generic strategy, which we're going to talk about in a second here. If we're competing, trying to compete on cost, we're going to derive a competitive advantage by reducing, well, if we're competing on price, rather, we're going to have to get a competitive advantage by reducing our costs. That's really the only option. If we are trying to be the lowest price, the only way we're going to make a profit is if we can get those costs lower and still have something left, some profit left over, given our lower price. If we're going to compete on differentiation, we have to provide something, some kind of superior value that allows us to charge a higher price. And and in that case, it's not just that we have to create the superior value, but it's possible the customer will have a very high willingness to pay, but competition drives the price down anyways, and the customer catches all the value. So we come now to Porter's generic strategies and expand on this a bit more. Porter argued that you can basically choose one of two broad sources of competitive advantage. Either you can either compete on price, in which case your competitive advantage is going to come from having lower costs than your competitors, right? If you're both charging the same price or you're charging a bit lower, the only way you're going to capture profit is by doing things more efficiently and lowering your cost. Or we can compete on differentiation. We can create additional value for which customers are willing to pay. Again, that doesn't necessarily on its own, the creation of value doesn't give us a competitive advantage on its own. We have to be able to appropriate that value. But then within these two broad categories, cost leadership and differentiation, we can also choose to serve the entire industry or to serve a single segment. And that's something you guys have to figure out with your companies. Does your company target the whole potential market or just a segment of it? In the case of the Nintendo Wii, they chose to target a particular segment of gamers, the fun gamer or the casual gamer, and really create a new segment. It was a differentiated, focused offering. Let's see, if you think about iPhones, that's a differentiated product. They cost more because customers will pay more for their features, but they're really targeting the whole smartphone market. Apple doesn't just target a particular age group or demographic or even geography. And so that would be industry-wide, or what we call broad differentiation. There are some phones out there now called like dumb phones or simple phones that some of them are very expensive and they deliberately don't have a lot of internet or social media connectivity. That would be differentiation with a narrow focus. It's targeting people. They used to look very much like they were targeted at the hipster crowd. And it's targeting a specific type of person who doesn't want all those features, and actually they're willing to pay more for less features. Now, of course, they have to have very nice industrial design if they want to charge that differentiated price and have other features to compensate for that lack of connectivity. We'll start getting into depth a bit more, starting with cost leadership and then differentiation. How can we what are some strategies for driving down costs, or what are some factors that can decrease our costs? Well, one of the surprising ones is what's known as the experience curve. This is the experience curve for the Model T, the Ford Model T between 1909 and 1920. And if you look at the bottom here, these are millions of units. As they increase the number of units, their cost of production goes down dramatically from roughly, let's say, $3,700 for the first few units, until by 1920 it's less than half the cost. It's less than $1,500 per unit. And here we're not talking about economies of scale. This isn't just because they had lots of fixed assets and we're churning out more units over a fixed cost base, which reduces, that's what economies of scale are. The more units you churn out, if all your costs are fixed, you have decreasing costs per unit, the more units you pump out. But this is just workers, management, everyone learning how to produce the thing more quickly and more effectively. If you've ever started a new job, your first day on the job, you're not a very valuable employee. You don't know how to do anything. It takes you a long time. When you've been somewhere for 5 years, 10 years, things that used to take you a long time, you can do very quickly. You're much more productive, strictly because you've just learned to do those things better, and you've become quicker at doing them. You become more efficient through learning. And that's a very real impact in manufacturing. Here's some other examples of experience curves for, on the left, Japanese clocks and watches, between 100,000 units and okay, it's saying million, so I guess between 100 million units and 1 billion units, the cost goes down from 30,000 yen to 15,000 yen, so it halves. For refrigerators in the UK, it's a slightly less dramatic slope, but the price goes down from roughly 150 to below 100 over the course of, say, what is it? It's kind of a goofy graph here, but let's say 100 million units. Now the lesson from that, and crucially, it's not that they're getting better. Time is not the factor on the x-axis. It's units of production. And I gave the example of working somewhere on their first day and versus 10 years. If you weren't doing anything for those 10 years, you're not learning. And it's not the time that is the factor. It's how many times you do the activity. The more you do something, the better you get at it. If you're working 100-hour weeks for 5 years, being very productive, you're going to go much further down that learning curve than if you're working 5 hours a week and almost forgetting what you're doing week on week. So there's this interesting association between market share and economies related to learning. And basically they say that, well, assuming that all firms in an industry have the same experience curves, right? Everyone who's making refrigerators has roughly the same learning curve, or if it's the clocks and watches, it's slightly more so. Then it's really just about, well, the more units we produce, the cheaper we will be with respect to our competition. And you do see this interesting relationship. Here we have market share in this graph on the x-axis and return on sales on the y-axis. And what we see is that firms who have low market share have negative return on sales. 0 to 10% market share, those firms tend to make a loss on average, whereas firms that have over 40% market share, I mean, you can look in each category there, the return on sales increases. The argument here being that that might be because of these learning effects. The more that a company produces, the more market share you have, the more you're producing, the more units you're producing with respect to that good or service. And so the more you go down that learning curve, and the more your costs decrease. It mentions here, there's a sort of a caveat. Association does not imply causation, right? First thing we learn in statistics is that correlation does not equal causation. However, the theory behind this is pretty strong, and the association is pretty strong. So it's worth paying attention to. If it's possible the arrow of causality in that correlation goes the other way, and that it's actually that companies who are more efficient produce more, or it might be some third factor that isn't captured, but the data seems to suggest that the greater your market share, the lower your costs because of those learning effects. The other caveat is that it's expensive to acquire market share, or it can be. If you have to go out and spend $500 million on advertising to capture that market share, well, that cost, the cost of capturing the market share might offset those learning curve advantages or the benefits from that learning curve. So one doesn't go, you would need to make a cost benefit analysis. How much do we think it will cost us to get more market share, and will that pay for itself or not with these learning effects? Here's the core drivers of cost advantage. If you determine that your firm is competing on a cost leadership, is competing on price, analyze each of these to see where they either currently are getting a cost advantage or where they could be getting one. First one, the most obvious one, is economies of scale. Large plants, if you have to enter an industry at scale, because of the size of the industry, it's estimated that you have to produce about 4 million vehicles per year to operate at an efficient scale in the American auto market. That can give you an advantage. Economies of learning, we've just discussed. If you have superior production techniques, right, those Japanese just-in-time and Six Sigma quality techniques that they introduced gave them a cost advantage for a couple decades. The way you design your products. Have a read of these. I'm not going to go over all of them in detail. Product design is an interesting one. There are things you can do with the design of your product, not to create more customer value, but to reduce your cost. The famous Model T example, Henry Ford said you could have any color you want as long as it's black. It was black because they saved money from not having to do multiple lines and multiple colors. They didn't customize the product. If you can have standardized parts that you can use across multiple lines, that's also going to give you economies of cost because of the way you're designing the product. Lots of car companies will use the same basic frame across different models, a standardized frame that they use for a few different models. Obviously, Apple uses the same chassis for different ranges of their MacBooks, and same with their iPhones. Those standardizations lower their costs. They can buy in bulk. It gives them economies of scale in procurement and in manufacturing. Capacity utilization, this is a pure fixed to variable cost, classic economies of scale. And then what they've just put here is residual efficiency. Again, if you think of statistics, this is the everything else that doesn't fit in the other categories. Perhaps you just have a more motivated production team. Your managers are more efficient. All these things that add up at the margins to give you a cost advantage. This here is looking at now not economies of learning, but economies of scale, the one we're all probably most familiar with. And oftentimes this is just related to the ratio of fixed cost to variable costs. And as you meet that payback point, you each additional unit has lower marginal costs. And for all of these economies, there's some optimal point where you get reduced marginal returns, right? It doesn't go, your cost doesn't go negative per unit, but it starts to, you get this line that what do they call them in math? An asymptote. It gradually approaches a point that it never goes below. At the beginning of the curve, the cost efficiencies per unit are quite dramatic, but it levels out, and eventually you get decreasing returns from increased size. This is just a list of different projects and how much they cost to develop. Some of these were profitable, some of these aren't, but some of them would be hard to copy. Not many firms have $240 billion to invest in R&D and project development. Not much more to say there, but perhaps of interest in terms of how much certain projects cost to launch. One of the other interesting facts about cost analysis is that, and we don't normally think about this, but there are economies of scale that you can get from advertising. Coca-Cola, because they sell so many units, that fixed cost, and advertising is in some senses a fixed cost. You don't pay it with each unit you produce. You have an advertising campaign and hope to sell as many units as possible on the base of that advertising to the extent that it was more or less successful. The more units you can sell from an advertising campaign, the more economies of scale you're going to get. Here we see that Coke, they sell a billion cases, and that means that the cost of the advertising for them is less than 2/100ths or around 2/100ths of a cent, 2 cents. Those are dollar units, 2 cents per case, versus Schweppes, who has a fraction of Coca-Cola's sale. They're paying almost 20 cents per case. So if you're able to have very effective advertising and marketing and sell a lot of units, you get cost advantages in your advertising. You sell more per dollar of advertising, and that can put your rivals at a disadvantage, especially if they can't afford to, or they don't have the capabilities to match your strengths in branding and advertising. How should you go about analyzing your firm if you're competing on costs? Well, the good old Porter's value chain here is a great place to look. First thing you need to do is identify the activities in your value chain. This is an example of an automobile company's value chain. Figure out where the costs are generated, what the proportion of your total cost is. Pretty easy way to do this is just look at your total costs on your income statement and then map them out proportionally. They should all add up to 100%. Figure out what the cost drivers are. What is the activity at each stage that is driving those costs? And then figure out if there's any way to reduce those costs or any way to get synergies between those costs. Is there anything we can be doing in the design engineering that will reduce our costs in the production stage or the component manufacture, right? We just looked at that a second ago. Can we standardize some of the parts when we're designing this product? I can't show it to you here, but if you look up, one of my favorite examples of this is the Fender guitars. Leo Fender, who makes Fender guitars, the famous Stratocaster and Telecaster, he designed his guitars so that they use about half as much wood in the neck, and all he had to do that was reduce the angle of the neck. If you think about a traditional guitar that you might have seen, the neck goes at an angle like that and the strings come up and go down it. Leo Fender said, well, that's a lot of wood that's going to waste. Why don't we just make it a straight neck? We can use less wood, and we'll just have something here to clamp the strings down and just go straight down the neck. That's a great example of the design of the product reducing costs in production. Looking at differentiation now, and thinking, when we start thinking about differentiation, sometimes but not always that might imply segmentation. But they are two different things. Differentiation is about how we're going to be different and offer something unique with respect to our competitors. Segmentation says, well, who or where are we going to sell this product? And we can have, as mentioned when we were looking at the generic strategies, we can have either broad scope or focused scope, and they have some examples here. Broad scope appeals to needs that are common or wants that are common between different customers. They give the example of McDonald's. McDonald's has no particular segment unless you're a vegetarian or a health food enthusiast, and even then everybody's had a McDonald's hamburger or McDonald's food probably at some point in their life. Focus differentiation appeals to just a segment. MTV, which I think just closed off, kind of finished. I believe they broadcast their last show recently. Very much targeted the Gen Xers. Shows like Beavis and Butthead, music videos by Nirvana, etc. Those were targeted at young people. It wasn't the baby boomers or the grandparents of these Gen Xers watching MTV. It was a young audience who was into music in particular, even though not all the shows were music shows. Harley Davidson specifically focuses on riders who want that classic American rebel image. although that's become problematic because that segment, as I've mentioned before, is aging out or dying. Armani appeals to high fashion. Not everyone wants to spend their hard-earned dollars on an expensive Armani suit or Armani accessory. They're not targeting everyone. Like iPhone is probably, as I said, another good example of broad scope differentiation. Armani, Louis Vuitton is a narrower scope of differentiation. Fine wine, expensive wines that appeal to certain drinkers and certain tastes would be focused differentiation. So you need to think about both what it is that you're doing, how you're trying to create that difference from your competitors and increase the willingness to pay, but also who you're targeting. It might be everyone in the case of broad scope, or it might be a segment. Two sides to differentiation. There's the demand side where you're creating the value for the customer and you're thinking about the customer side of things. First thing you do is, well, you have a product. What needs does it satisfy? What are its key attributes? Then you start to think about the customer. Well, does the customer actually, how do they choose the product? Does the customer, if you're thinking about laptops, do our customers demand a front-facing camera? Lots of gaming laptops don't have a front-facing camera, so those companies obviously decided their customers cared more maybe about a thin screen bezel or high-performance graphics cards more than they cared about a front-facing camera. And when you've decided, okay, well, what do customers want and what are these decision criteria? First of all, how do their preferences link to those attributes? There's no point putting a very expensive graphics processing card in a computer for someone who's not a gamer or who isn't doing video editing. They're just not going to use it. The second thing is, well, what price premiums do those product attributes command? And there's some really interesting analyses here. Companies, if you're adding a feature that's very expensive, and is more expensive than the concomitant willingness to pay increase by your customer, that's not a good feature to add. You want to add features that customers will pay a premium for. Final thing to understand about your customers, what motivates them? Who are your customers? Are there demographic attributes like MTV, sort of Gen Xers? Are there sociological attributes? Are you an ethical outdoor clothing company like Patagonia? Are there psychological drivers? Is it an impulse item that customers don't really plan to buy, but then they buy it at the counter of the gas station? And so all these different factors and considerations will determine the strategy that you select and that you formulate. Well, we're going to select the product and position it with respect to the features it has, and try and match those in our advertising to the needs of the customers that we want to fulfill. We're also going to perhaps segment a particular or not a particular group of customers. If we do decide to segment, if we're doing broad focus, then maybe not. Ensure that the customers and the product that you've designed actually meet each other, that gaming laptop, make sure the features you've added are what gamers actually want and will do the things they want. If you have a product issue with, I don't know, bad internet lag or something, that's not going to work for a gamer. Gamers will want very high screen refresh rates that other users won't care about, and then evaluate the costs and benefits. The cost of creating that differentiation or creating that feature need to be less than the benefit and willingness to pay of the customer. Looking at the supply side now, the actual production, here potential sources of uniqueness, the product features and performance that we've talked about, complementary services. A lot of heavy machinery producers have to offer, or customers like it if they offer things like credit, delivery, repair. A lot of furniture shops, especially places that sell slightly more expensive furniture, offer credit as well and delivery. Other ways to make yourself unique with a brand or very effective advertising. Maybe what was the most recent controversial one? The Sydney Sweeney's has great jeans. Was that some cost benefit analysis would have been performed there? Any technology embodied in the design. Um, Sometimes, so things like Teflon frying pans. There's a technology, the Teflon technology, that non-stick technology. You might put that in a frying pan to increase the price that customers are willing to pay. Now, it's been around for a while, so customers won't pay as much anymore because it's everywhere. But initially, customers would pay more to have that technology in their frying pans. The quality of the purchased inputs. Some products benefit from high quality, more expensive inputs. Trying to think of an example here. Guitars again. If you're going to sell a Gibson guitar, the customer wants high quality, expensive wood in the guitar. Mahogany is an expensive wood. They could use cheaper wood. Fender uses poplar and occupies a lower price position. Poplar is a very cheap wood. Mahogany is a very expensive wood for which customers pay more because it has different acoustic properties. Procedures that impact the customer experience. Maybe customer service. Frequency of sales visits. Maybe they want more sales visits, maybe they want less. Some restaurants, you expect the waitress or waiter will come and see you regularly so that you're never waiting to order something else or waiting for another top up of your drink or whatever. Some venues don't need that or don't want that. If you go to a British pub, there is no rail service. You go to the bar to order anything you want. There's places like that in the US as well. Location can be important. Are customers willing to pay more to get access to you in certain locations? Think airports, right? Everybody wants food at the airport. You pay a premium to get that sandwich, right? You wouldn't pay $15 for a sandwich anywhere else, but when you're in the airport, you're kind of a captive audience. Another source of uniqueness on the supply side, degree of vertical integration. This is another example where Apple does very well. You can only get the M3 chip from Apple, and that quality in the Apple products is because they are backwards integrated, both in terms of, so if you buy an Apple laptop, you're getting the Mac OS operating system, which you can only get from Apple because they've integrated backwards into operating systems. You can only get the M3 or M4 chip from Apple because they've backwards integrated into chip manufacturing. So that allows them on the production side to create differentiation. A couple more considerations here with differentiation. Two important things are, well, within the broader concept of product integrity, there are two sub-levels of integrity, what we call internal integrity, the consistence between the function and the structure. Does the thing do what it was designed to do? A good example of poor internal integrity is the iPhone 6. If you remember the iPhone 6s didn't do what they were intended. They were very thin, but it was 2012 or whatever, and all the hipsters were wearing tight jeans, and the phones bent in their pockets. That was poor internal consistency. They had a problem with the performance of the product itself. And then there's external integrity, the fit between the product and the customer's objectives, values, and lifestyle. If Monsanto tried to release a line of organic foods, that would be poor external integrity. Customers don't associate the Monsanto brand with chemical-free organic products. And good products do both of these. There's good internal integrity. The product functions as intended. There's sort of a quality control issue here. And there's also external integrity. The features of the product and the product itself align with the lifestyle that their customers, or the habits of their customers. This is an example of how an industry further back in the value chain can still use a differentiated strategy. So you might think that if you are a manufacturer, well, how do you, or providing what's called an intermediate product, can you still be differentiated, or are you doomed to compete on price? Well, the example here is the can manufacturing industry, which just provides cans to firms producing food or drinks. And the idea here is, well, you still can have a differentiated strategy, either by producing a higher quality product or input for your business-to-business customer, by delivering, by being more reliable for delivering on time and in the amounts. Maybe you need to be more flexible. If you can be a very flexible supplier, customers will pay more. By easing or integrating your systems with your business-to-business customer, having good customer service, all these things allow the supplier of another industry to still charge a premium price. Some shipping companies are well known for having very reliable service in an industry that is otherwise not very reliable, and so their customers will pay more to use those shippers, even though it's not the end user, it's not a retail product. The other shippers in that industry can't compete on reliability, and so that company has established a more competitive and valuable position. So here's a summary of key considerations and the resources and capabilities required for both cost leadership and differentiation strategies. We've talked about those a fair bit, but this is a great summary slide. And yeah, we will see you all next week, week 4, as we continue our lectures. Have a great weekend.